play around with your air conditioning, the chances of PC rent or endophthalmitis may increase. So I'll be discussing about the practical aspects of handling the endophthalmitis patients or the posterior capsular rent and doing the anterior vitrectomy. Me along with Dr. Bharat Mehta will be discussing that aspect. Then of course, you may not be calling your optometrist daily on duty, so there'll be alternate duty work. You may get the refractive prices. This embarrassing and problematic situation is to be dealt by Dr. Anita Sethi, who is a senior consultant at RPA. And after that, you may still have some post-operative glaucomas happening, which many times because of less frequent post-op follow-ups, you may be missing out. So the issue of post-operative glaucoma will be taken care by Dr. Prachi Mehta for us. And in the end, all of us are going to be discussing some practical and doable aspects that we have to modify in our system to save ourselves from corona infection. We don't want to talk about what textbooks are saying, rather what all the circulars are saying, something which is doable, practical, and safe for us. We will be talking about a medium level center like my center of Synergy Visit Eye Center, or even a corporate hospital. Dr. Anita Sethi, since she's in Portis, she'll be telling us about the corporate hospital setups also. Along with this, we'll be having very interesting and exciting question answer session with our very esteemed panelists, which are all our in-house panelists. I'm really very fortunate to have the experience and wisdom of Professor Bhattacharya, Dr. Vivek Pal, Dr. Satish Gupta, and Dr. Arun Sangal with us, along with a lot of experience of relatively younger colleagues, my age group, like Dr. Amrita Kapoor, Dr. Surbhi Dutt, and Dr. Mayank Bansal, who Mayank Bansal, by the way, also happens to be a researcher along with a retina specialist, and he is actually working in the same lab which has come out with the new CRISPR-based diagnostic tool for COVID. So I think we can have a lot of discussions about ophthalmology and also about COVID towards the end. So I would be starting my webinar now. If there are any questions, there is a question box that is there. You can always put in your questions there. Dr. Anita will be looking at all the questions and she'll be moderating the question answer sessions for us. So without wasting any more time, I think we will start with our first presentation, which is about managing a posterior capsular rent and how to handle the situation, which is something which is very, very common, very, very important for all of us to take care of. So what I say, what I've always maintained is that every cataract surgeon, he must know 2 steps before he starts doing a cataract surgery, whether he's beginning to learn cataract surgery or when he's going to be starting his cataract surgery after 1.5 months or 2 months of break. First is how to manage a PC rent and do anterior vitrectomy. And second is how to give intravitreal injection in case there's endophthalmitis. Because these 2 steps have to be done by the anterior segment surgeon himself. So I'll be covering both the aspects in the 2 different talks. So let's start with the PC rent management. So as we know, successful cataract surgery means removal of opaque lens, implanting the lens without causing any complication, especially PC rent. As we know, PC rent is the beginning of most of the complications of cataract surgery. It may lead to nucleus drop, problems with placing of the IOL, CME, retinal tears and detachment, glaucoma, corneal decompensation, uveitis, increased chances of endophthalmitis, and above all, this is one complication that gives us a lot of problems to the sleepless nights, the surgeon also. So what do we do? First of all, don't be scared of vitreous. We guys deal with vitreous day in and day out, and vitrectomized eyes do very well. So don't be scared that if there's a vitreous, things would kind of go bad. You should know the principles and anatomy of vitreous and its complications. Do not act in any haste or reflex, but be ready in every case. So whenever you have an OT, or rather your setup should be such that you should have some trial runs of a PC rent. So everyone in your OT should be aware what to do when the PC rent happens. Because you don't want to waste any more time at that time. Normally patients are being done under topical. You don't want to raise your voice. You don't want to have any panic happening in the OT. Each and every member of the OT should be aware what is to be done in case of PC rent. So have a plan of action in place. This is very, very important. For every OT, you must know how you're going to be handling your PC rent case. Right? What I recommend that you should have a PC rent kit in your place, which should be kept at a fixed place where every recommend for the kit are the follows. A sharp 25 gauge cutter is very important, or whichever gauge that you're comfortable with. And also keep a cutter also. In case that sterile cutter that you have kept is not working, don't play around, open a new cutter. These are complications which happen once in a while. We don't want to be stingy about saving cost, but we should treatment to the unsterile puncture. And you should also keep 25 gauge, which is especially that I'm going to be explaining to you later. What we kept this in case there's a parent and you want to create a barrier out there, you can use this code. And you must have invented you rigid AC and rigid PC so that in case there's a change plan can always place equivalent IUL. In case you are equipped to manage vitrectomies also, like in Exeter, you must have a phaco-frac tip and a handpiece ready with you, which is ETO'd, so it is kept sterile. At that time, you are not going to be searching for equipment which is not sterile or something, but the thing should be kept in your OT, along with the new vitrectomy that should be reserved for cases of drop lens management. So this is important to have this PC kit with you. And when you have a PC rent, recognize it early, prevent extension, and release any undue pressure that may be there. Now, when you have a PC rent without vitreous loss, do not take out the instruments immediately. Push visco from the side port and then only remove the instruments. That way, the further vitreous loss is minimized. You can do dry aspiration, check the status of vitreous, and implant a PCIUL. But in case the PC rent has a vitreous loss already, make sure your wound is watertight. In case it is not, do the suturing. Use automated vitrectomy cutter. Gone are the days of using scissors for vitrectomy. Every phaco machine has a cutter port. So every person should be having a cutter with him and he should be using vitrectomy cutter only. And do an anterior vitrectomy without any traction. The tips are you use a good sharp sterile cutter, moderate suction of about 150 millimeter of mercury, maximum cut rate which is possible on your machine. Every machine is different. So whatever maximum cut rate it gives you, that is better for you. Do not use a coaxial irrigation. Use irrigation from a separate side port with a 23 gauge cannula. And when you use the cutter, that cutter should always be facing upwards. So you should be seeing what you're cutting. And you should have separate port for irrigation and vitrectomy. So what you do in PC rent, so when there's a PC rent that is happening, the vitreous is coming out, right? That causes a bit of a pull outside. And if you're cutting at the wound, if you're pulling out the vitreous, you're going to be causing traction at the vitreous base or at the fovea. This traction would lead to a retinal tear in the ora area or a CME in the area of macula. So therefore, you must not pull out the vitreous. Rather, you should go inside through the PC rent into the anterior vitreous and then start doing the vitrectomy there so that the vitreous is getting sucked inside. So there is no traction happening at the vitreous base or at the fovea. This is most important tip that I would like to give for someone who's doing anterior vitrectomy. Don't pull out the vitreous out of the wound. Go inside through the PC rent into the anterior vitreous and then do the vitrectomy. So at the end of the vitrectomy, your anterior vitreous should be concave like this without any traction. And then you clear the anterior vitreous. You can also use the cutter itself to remove all the residual lens matter. So for that, you just switch off the cutter and pull on the residual lens matter without damaging the capsule anymore. Make sure that at the end of the surgery, the pupil is nice and round. You may use Kinocort also to stain the vitreous to make sure all the vitreous has been taken out, and then implant a PC or an ACIOL depending upon the kind of capsular support you have. Nowadays, we hardly ever implant an ACIOL. We normally would be able to implant it on in the sulcus or in the bag, depending upon the type of PC rent. The alternate route that I'm going to be recommending is that you may use a pars plana route for doing the vitrectomy. So for doing that, you first implant the 3-piece foldable lens in the sulcus, seal the wound, and then make a 25 gauge trocar entry through the limbus, about 3 to 3.5 millimeter from the limbus. Do the infusion through the limbal side port and go through the pars plana and do the vitrectomy behind the lens. And again, here you have to use a sharp and new trocar because that is very important for making a nice valvular incision, and do a thorough anterior vitrectomy and a cortical removal. So this is one small video I would like to show. This is one of my colleagues who was operating at my center. So you can see that when she was trying to stain, there was an air bubble that led to uneven staining of the capsule. Now, since she was experienced, she thought, okay, she can manage it through that. So, but somewhere during the rexes, she could kind of lost the way. She could not see the capsule very well. So she decided, okay, I'm going to extend it to a can opener and I'm going to still do the phaco, bring the thing in the anterior chamber and do the phaco. So the capsulotomy was not adequate. And then during the phaco, you will see that somewhere the capsulotomy extension has happened and the PC rent has occurred. But somehow the surgeon at that time didn't realize it. So just when this last part of the cortical matter was being removed, when she comes out, you can see the extension enlarging and the vitreous coming out. So just about now, you see. So now you can see the PC rent extending, and that is when I was called in the OT. So now here we had a case where anterior capsule and posterior capsule both were not very strong. So I decided to use the alternate route. I implanted a 3-piece foldable lens inside in the sulcus. So there was anterior and posterior capsule, both which were kind of supporting it. I made sure the lens was nice and stable out there, hydrated the wound. Then I measured about 3.5 millimeter from the limbus. And then here you see when you go in with a trocar, you go in, but you don't twist the trocar. You go in straight like that. Because if you twist, you're going to be converting a valvular entry into a circular one. And then this wound is not going to be watertight. So use a sharp trocar and don't twist. This is very important for those who want to use a trocar. And then infusion goes in through the anterior side and the trocar, the cutter goes in behind. And you can very nicely do the anterior vitrectomy first. After you've cleared the vitreous, then only you go and tackle the residual cortical matter and take it out with the suction. Another advantage of this technique is that, say, wherever you have got more of cortical matter, you can decide to make your trocar entry at the opposite end so that you've got maximum coverage of the cortical matter from that angle. So you may decide to make it on the supratemporal, supranasal. You can even go inferiorly. Since it's a trocar entry, you can go from any of the direction that you want. So here, after completing the anterior vitrectomy, you are putting the cutting off and you're sucking out the cortical matter. So you're clearing up the whole of the cortical matter very clearly. And now you see a good and nice vitrectomy has been done without any distortion at the corneal level. The visibility is very good and the lens is very stable and there is no damage, no further damage to the anterior or posterior capsule, which sometimes may happen when you're going through the anterior route because of the distortion in the cornea. You may end up damaging a bit of lens matter that might be, the capsular support that might be there. I'm just testing about the stability of the lens, which is okay. And at the end, we remove the trocar. So it still stays to be a sutureless surgery. And this patient got very good results, 6.9 unaided, 6.6 with correction. So the advantages of pars plana route is that you can implant the lens first. So you minimize the damage of any further damage to the capsule, avoids pulling on the vitreous and any traction on the vitreous base and fovea. It's very easy to clear the residual cortical matter and there is no distortion of the wound that is happening. The only downside is that the people have to learn how to use the trocar. But if you follow the simple step of keeping a sharp, clean trocar and also not twisting, it is not very difficult. And many people are now using trocar, anterior segment people are using trocar. So this is a possibility to do that. Now I'm going to be showing 2 more surgeries which were done only yesterday. The date of surgery is 21st of May. So this is a drop nucleus that was sent to me. This surgery was done about 2 months back, but because of the lockdown, the patient couldn't come in. So the lens was already implanted by the surgeon. So you see, I have made the 25 gauge ports and we are just trying to, first, after doing anterior vitrectomy, we are removing all the cortical matter without damaging the capsule. After doing that, you go in and then you do the vitrectomy. You don't straight away jump to the drop nucleus. You first try to do the vitrectomy. Because it was an old case, there was a bit of adhesion that was there around the nucleus. So I'm trying to free up the nucleus with those adhesions. I'm doing the vitrectomy around that and freeing up the nucleus. And you can see the adhesions are pretty strong. Now the nucleus is lying on the posterior pole, so it is quite free. So after that, you again complete your vitrectomy before you go in with a phaco-frag. You complete your vitrectomy as much as possible up to the equator. And then you make another port, 19 gauge port, through which you are going to be putting in a phaco-frag needle. And so you have got one port which is 19 gauge, all the rest ports are 25 gauge. And now with the phaco-frag, you use the suction to bring it up to the mid-vitreous and then you start giving the phaco power. So you're doing the phaco well away from the retinal surface. Even after keeping a vacuum, the pieces will fall back. Then you again go back there, pick it up with the suction, and then start doing phaco in the anterior mid-vitreous only. The smaller pieces are slowly taken up. This whole surgical duration was about 23 to 24 minutes for the whole surgery from beginning till the end. And a bit of a cleanup. And since the IOL was already in place, there wasn't much to be done. We just closed that 19 gauge ports and the other ports are self-sealing. So that was the end of the surgery. And this was done only yesterday, so I don't have the post-op results on phone. Not called out for a follow-up today. So another fresh surgery I'm showing from yesterday. I had got 2 of drop. So you can see. So we all you anterior visible. The pupil was not dilated too much. So that was, yeah. I check me matter. So that's a kind of a cortical matter. There was a very the AC talk when I now yeah. I'm just going back. Sorry. Sorry, this I think I lost it there. So I'll just go back to this. So here, what I have done a small modification in my technique is that I use the suction from the vitrectomy cutter to pick up the lens. I'll go back to that. Sorry. And then rather than using a forceps, I often use the suction of the cutter to bring up the lens above. That is a simple atraumatic way. And now I'm putting that thing over my light pipe. And because the incision has already been enlarged, I just bring it up gently, making sure the IOL doesn't drop back. And I just use my McPherson to grab it from the anterior chamber, and then I bring it out. So this way you can manage many times without using any forceps also, and without causing any damage to the retina. So you can see this was a single piece lens. So this we had to replace with a rigid lens. The incision was already enlarged. So I'm putting a 6.5 millimeter lens on the residual anterior capsular support. And you can see there's a bit of cortical matter that is left behind. I intentionally did not remove it first because of the small pupil, the visibility was poor. Now that the IOL is in place, the bone is sutured, we go in again and clear up all the rest of the cortical matter that is there, and also complete the vitrectomy. The whole capsular bag along with IOL had gone behind with some hemorrhage. Here, after completing the vitrectomy again, I tried to bring it up again with the suction, but this thing just kept circulating around and we couldn't get a very good grip. So I made a small opening in that capsular bag and grabbed that capsular bag opening with the forceps. So that was again safe away from the retina. Bring it up and then do a handshake, take it with the McPherson and bring it out. So to conclude, though it is best to avoid PC rent, a properly managed PC rent can avoid most of the potential complications. So while good surgeons can perform surgery without complications, the expert surgeons know how to manage their complications successfully. So it is okay to have complications, but it is not okay not to know how to manage them. To err is human, but managing it well is divine. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Vinay. That was an excellent demonstration of how to manage our dreaded complication PCR. And, you being a retinal surgeon, you made it look very, very easy. It's not that easy for the rest of us. So I actually just, along with all the instruments, like to have my retinal surgeon quite close by so that they can manage this. So the questions have all started coming in. I'm going to just ask you to the first question that has come in from the Dr. Jayashree, who wants to know what are the parameters for 23 anterior vitrectomy in case of PCR. I know you've already mentioned it, but just to highlight, for 23G anterior vitrectomy, what are the parameters to be kept?
I think Dr. Jayashree is one of the very conscientious ones. She sent us this question well before the webinar started. So yeah. I hope I have answered this question. I appreciate your interest in having sent the questions well in advance. So as I said, keep the cutter maximum that is allowed on your machine. Some machines have 750, some machines have 2,500. The more some machines have 5,000. The more the cut rate, the lesser the chance of traction. The suction has to be very moderate and very low at about 150 only. And whether you use 25 gauge, 23 gauge, or 20 gauge depends upon what is available. But what I recommend, if you are anyway keeping a cutter, keep a 25 gauge, works quite fine. It goes in very easily to the side port also. So you can, it's very, very versatile instrument. So that's what I would say. Another thing what I would like to comment, which I forgot, thanks Dr. Neeta for reminding, is that always keep your posterior segment person in the loop. You must know what to do when you have a PC rent or a drop nucleus. And that should be in understanding with a posterior segment person. So someone might like I personally like people to put in an IOL before they send the case to me. So like this gentleman sent the case to me with an IOL implanted. That makes my job easier. But in case your posterior segment surgeon is not comfortable with that, you do accordingly whatever he wants to do. So every anterior segment surgeon should be friend with posterior segment surgeon and should know what exactly he is looking for. And the same thing I'll be talking about in my talk about endophthalmitis also, because the moment you have a case of endophthalmitis, keep the other person in the loop, because the chances are that he may be going to that person. So, he has to be involved in that decision-making process right from the beginning, whether he is required or not. So that is very important.
Great. Thanks, Dr. Vinay. So there's a question from Dr. Nilesh Mohan. Nilesh, really nice to hear from you after so many years. He wants to know, and I'm going to ask Dr. Sangal this question. So Dr. Sangal, please come back. How do you ensure that you do not enlarge the small rent? Okay, sometimes we see that there's a small rent. Dr. Sangal? Dr. Sangal? Hanji, please unmute yourself. How do you ensure that you do not enlarge? Some of it Vinay has already mentioned, but any tips that you would like to give? How do you ensure that you do not enlarge the small rent? Dr. Sangal? I think Dr. Sangal is on the phone. Dr. Vivek, would you like? Ah, there he is, right. Dr. Sangal, did you hear the question? Huh?
Yeah, the only thing which I realize is that it's absolutely not in your hand. Once the vitreous starts coming, I mean, it just flows out and you just have to keep doing the vitrectomy. Once it's all eyes soft, the vitreous is all there, then only you can assess and see how much is the rent and then decide your further course of action. I don't think so you can really, how can you, last minute you're reducing the pressure and all will be a difficulty.
Right. So that was another question, that whether we should start mannitol, when you notice. I would just add one thing, is that you do get to know when you see the rent. And as Dr. Vinay said, I'd like to emphasize, don't immediately remove your instruments out, because you're going to get an increased upthrust. So you keep your one instrument in, inject viscoelastic from the other side, and then take out your instrument and then assess whether you think you can manage it yourself or you want to call for help. So that's probably the only thing that we can do. Yes, Dr. Gupta, would you like to add to that?
Another good idea will be to put a 25 gauge anterior chamber maintainer, so that there is a positive pressure in the anterior chamber and vitreous doesn't tend to come out. That will keep the size of the rent same.
Yes, but I also feel you might hydrate the vitreous.
Yeah, that's the problem.
It doesn't hydrate.
You have to balance.
It always
Okay, Dr. Mayank, would you like to add to that?
Yes, in addition to this, something which very initially I did find useful was, of course, the use of corticosteroid, triamcinolone. It's like putting a white sheet over a ghost. So it really helps delineate where the vitreous might be lying.
Okay, yeah, that's great. So thanks for emphasizing. One more question, and that's for Dr. Gupta. So during these cases, when there's so much handling, we find that the pupil starts to come down. So any suggestions as to how we should manage that?
If the pupil is coming down, then you should be prepared with the pupil expander, because working with a small pupil makes the things worse. So if you dilate the pupil with a pupil expander, or for that matter, you can use iris hooks to enlarge the pupil, that the things become easier.
So Dr. Gupta, is there a chance of vitreous getting entangled in your expander? I'm just wondering. Or
When you are doing vitrectomy, it will be pulled out of the loops.
Okay, okay, great. So one more question has come in from the audiences. Is there a risk of COVID with vitrectomy? I think we'll answer the COVID part right at the end when we are dealing with all the all the questions on COVID. So we'll just put that to the end, and we'll now go on to the next talk, which is my talk, and I'll just share my screen. Okay, just 1 second. So I'm going to talk about the post-operative refractive surprise, how to keep the patient happy. And I'm going to limit this just to cataract surgery because there's not enough time to talk about all refractive surgeries. So what's this? Cataract surgery today has really become a lot like a refractive surgery because there is better technology. There's Dr. Google advising all the patients, and there are very high expectations on us, the cataract surgeons. What is a refractive surprise? It is when the post-operative refraction differs from the planned result or from the patient's expectations. So this is where the role of preoperative counseling comes in. Patients sometimes have very unrealistic expectations because so-and-so in their satsang never needed any glasses and so-and-so could see, up to the moon and back. So we must really myopic patients surprised when they can't see their text messages in spite of you telling them that you will only be corrected for distance. They sometimes have a very selective hearing. So preoperative counseling, very important, and we're probably reaching the part where we might actually have to record our consent, because even though they sign on consent, they say कि हमें नहीं पता था हम क्या sign कर रहे थे. So we might reach the part where to cover ourselves legally, we might actually have to record an informed consent. So choose the patients very carefully for your premium IOLs, because the moment the patient pays more, their expectations also skyrocket. This is a good time to invest in your chair time pre-op. Otherwise, they will really eat your head post-operatively. So choose your patients very carefully for multifocals and other premium IOLs. So why do we get a refractive surprise? It's either because of incorrect pre-op planning or because of some glitch in the OT. Inaccurate biometry, either your measurement or your formulae, you use the wrong one, that's the commonest. And especially in cases of post-operative cataract post-refractive surgery, post-PK, infants and children. The OT glitches is where you have not got a good protocol of matching the patient with the lens, or in a toric IOL, if you have placed it in the wrong alignment, or maybe a lens has gone in upside down, or in case of a PC rent, if you've had to place it in the sulcus and you didn't have the correct power available. Very rarely, it's no reason at all. If you actually go into it like a detective, you will find the reason. Prevention is the most important. So prevention starts right from the good history. And this is where you need to counsel your optometrist to take the history. They must take a history of a previous. By the time the patient comes to you, he may be having a nuclear cataract, and you might feel that, oh, this is a myope, but you must ask for the previous refractive error. History of refractive surgery, which usually is around 20 years ago, and patients have conveniently forgotten that they even had a refractive surgery. In our case, at least we can see the incisions. If it's elastic, we actually may not even see anything. So you must ask for history of refractive surgery, history of amblyopia, because they may have been seeing poorly from that eye right from the beginning, and later on they say, but we are not seeing. And you're also puzzled as to why are we not, why is the vision not good, or why is there a refractive surprise? So you must take a history of amblyopia and fellow eye status, very, very important. I always do biometry of both eyes so that you can get some clues from the fellow eye and how it has fared. Very careful biometry. These are so important for preventing a refractive surprise. So now the axial lens is obviously the most important part, because an error of 1 millimeter is going to affect our forceps of refraction by up to 2.5 diopters. So contact is really where we might have this error because of extra pressure. We end up getting maybe a myopic result. Already we've been asked this question, that what do we do if we don't have optical? Optical, no doubt, optical biometer is the gold standard, but there are enough studies to show that a well-done immersion is almost as good. And now all the machines will be selling you contact immersion. I mean, it's not that hard to get an immersion. So I would say just do immersion, because you will get almost as good a result as the optical, if not better, in the really hard cataract. So I think immersion is the way to go, and we should all be very familiar, our optometrists, ourselves, if we do it, with the immersion ultrasonic biometry. So careful biometry, especially when you have extremes of axial lens or high myopia, high hypermetropia. When you're finding a difference between the two eyes, be even more careful, because usually both eyes should be similar. Operated RDs, siliconized eyes, you are going to have difficulty in your biometry. You need to be extra careful. Keratometry, you need to be more careful in post-refractive surgery, post-PK. And I would say any of the above, wherever you are feeling that there is some doubt, do two independent technicians can take a reading, 2 or more readings, or just do one more yourself. So these are the cases where you have to be very, very careful. In the OT, you must have a good protocol. Nowadays, any BH asks you for a timeout or a sign in at the time before starting. And like in our hospital, IOL power is not in that sheet. I've just got it added. You must check the patient's name, and sometimes patients have same names. So you must be very, very careful. Check the patient's name, check the eye, and check the IOL power before you start your surgery. Have your standby lenses, especially in posterior polar and hard cataract, wherever you feel that maybe there's going to be a problem. Have standby lenses, and maybe have an inventory of your AC lenses or your 3-piece lenses as your standby lenses, so that you can put in the correct power if need be. Toric lenses, be very careful with your marking. A bubble marker is the best way to mark in the upright position. So please do that carefully, do your marking, so that you do get your zero axis properly and you don't end up with some errors there. So these are the preventive. Now, what happens if you've done all of that and you still get a post-operative refractive surprise? So what should we do now? In the small error, you can probably correct it with glasses. So don't ever promise your patient that there will be no glasses. You have to say reduce dependency on glasses. Don't ever tell them that there'll be no glasses, because that's going to be a promise very hard, to live up to. Check what's the status of the fellow eye. Like if you have made this patient a little bit myopic, maybe when you do the other eye, you can make them emmetropic and they can balance better. So you must counsel them in the small errors, and just don't let them feel like it's the end of the end of the world. Tell them if need be we can make corrections, but why don't you try it out? So counseling will really go a long way in making them more comfortable. But what do we do if it's a moderate error, or if there is a premium IOL over here? What do we do then? So here we might need to go for the surgical ways. Intraocular could be explantation, piggyback lens for repositioning, LASIK or PRK, and rarely if there is, you can do a YAG capsulotomy, which can also help the position of the lens. So the timing of the explantation, if it's in the same day and you figure it out at the end of your list, one lens went the wrong way, on the same sitting, just correct it, take it out and correct it. If it's later, you verify the need, see that we really need to do a surgery, because no patient is very, very happy at the thought of a second surgery, and we should only do if we really need. If we find that yes, we need it, we should really go earlier rather than later to avoid fibrosis. And in case there is a PCO developing, please delay the YAG, because it would be very difficult to do an explantation with the capsular opening. So how do we do it? We need to be prepared with our anterior vitrectomy. There may be a PC rent. We should have replacement various lenses. Use lots of viscoelastic. You can use visco to protect your cornea. So we would bring the lens out of the bag into the AC and cut it up to the midpoint. First, prolapse the haptic out. Video seems to be lagging. You prolapse the haptic, and then we need to cut the optic. I'm showing a keyhole technique in which we cut it up to the center. We don't have to go all the way through and make it into two pieces. We can cut it till the center. And then we will engage it into the wound, like in taking a key out of a keyhole. Chabi ko guchche se jab nikalte. So you should have part of the lens will be, I don't know, the video doesn't seem to be working. Part of it would be into the wound and part below, and then we can just rotate it out like we rotate out the key from the keyhole. So anyway, we'll play it later if it's playing later. Sorry, it seems to have frozen a bit. Okay, so now in a malpositioned toric, if we have to replace it or correct the positioning, it should be done early within 2 weeks. Now, in order to know exactly what could be the position, it's good to use this website, which tells you what is the rotation that is required to make your correction. You should have a standby lens, and you must counsel before and after, because I would always tell the torics that there'll be a decreased dependence on glasses. So you can see this is where the toric is, and then after repositioning, this is where it has come to. So again, counseling is very, very important in these cases. Then the other option is a piggyback IOL, which can be done when there is a residual large refractive error. Sometimes you need to plan it in high hypermetropia because we can only go up to 30-35 diopters in most IOLs. The features of this is that it should have a smooth edge, and overall length is 13 to 14 millimeters for sulcus fixation. But you need to be careful in choosing which lenses to put as piggyback. So you have to watch out for the interface opacities. The calculation is done by a particular formula. So there is the Sulcoflex supplementary IOLs, where it has a posterior angulation to avoid the iris shape. It has a posterior concave surface, and you can actually have multifocal and toric in these lenses as well. The other one is a Star Surgical lens, which is a silicone lens. I know the Sulcoflex are available and people have been using them. I'm not sure if the Star Surgical is available. So this is just showing you how you put it in. Basically, it has to go into the sulcus. And this is a video showing the putting the an axis of 3-piece lens on top. I don't know, are the videos showing? So it's not showing on my screen. Okay. So you first need to put viscoelastic into the sulcus. Sometimes it may be synechia if it is an old case. You need to release all the synechia. This is a 3-piece lens that's being put in.
I think maybe if you have video, you can show that later out of the
I'll show it
presentation.
later. Yeah, I know it's for some reason it's just it's okay. Not even allowing me to move for some reason. Okay, so then we come to another technique, which is probably the more popular technique, which is LASIK or PRK for residual refractive errors. PRK can be done quite early. LASIK, we should wait for 3 to 6 months. And PRK is actually probably safer because these are older patients. We don't want an elevation of IOP. We don't want dry eye. So probably this is the safer. And the best part of this using excimer laser, that we are treating the manifest refraction. There's no calculation required. We can actually treat exactly what we can see. So, this is probably the best way. Now, post RK cataract, and we are getting a lot of those now because these are the people who are around 45 to 50 and they are coming to us with cataract. Sometimes they don't even tell us. This patient came saying he wants multifocal, he wants another laser. So it's really, and these are the fussy patients because they did get the RK done 20, 25 years ago. So you need to really counsel these patients well. You need to decide on which lens, which power. I would always go for a monofocal using the ASCRS calculator. Your technique has to be modified. You must make your incision in between the RK incisions, do a low fluidics because you can get a gape. And there is going to be a hyperopic surprise. There is. And it's going to take up to 3 to 4 weeks to settle down. So you must counsel the patient accordingly and just tell them to be patient. So this is a really good, very good for both RK and any refractive surgery done beforehand. Just remember that in post-RK, the cornea is very, very flat and they have a limit. You can't go lower than a certain amount, for your K. So you might need to go with whatever the lowest is available. And actually, whatever you get from this, even from this, I would say add a little more because you are going to end up being a little hyperopic. It's always better. And these are usually younger patients, 45 to 50, not so used to their hyperopic glass, their presbyopic glasses anyway. So add 1.5 to 2 diopters more. So just to summarize, prevention really is the best. And I would like to say, keep an ABC. Remember, be alert for this in all your cases. We've not been doing surgeries for a while. Our regular optometrist may or may not be there. So be very, very alert for all your cases. Be very, very careful with biometry. Please do good counseling before and after surgery. Do use a piggyback lens if required, and explantation only if it's a very gross error. Like recently, I got a +10 errors. I mean, really criminal, but that's what happened. Had to explant it. And excimer enhancement is a much better, easier way to deal with it, especially if it's a myopic error. And you can wait from 1 to 3 months. Okay, so thanks for your attention. I'll just stop the sharing. And okay. So some of the questions that we did get in earlier was, how soon should explantation be done? I think we've already discussed that. And I'm going to ask Dr. Pal, what do you prefer for if you do get a refractive surprise, what is it that you prefer to do, Dr. Pal?
I see something which you explained very well. If it's a myopic error and it's more than -3, so that presbyopia doesn't compensate for it, I'll always prefer a LASIK, PRK or a LASIK. Because then no extra manipulation is required. I don't have to put a piggyback lens, which is very expensive. Explantation is, of course, very major surgery. much more major than a basic cataract surgery. And then the cost factor also comes up. So for a small myopic error, even a large myopic error up to -6 also, LASIK or PRK is the best option. That is number one. If it's a hyperopic error, then it's a slightly tricky situation because explantation is again difficult. Piggyback is not all that easy. And LASIK may not give us that good results because they are never very good in hyperopia. So hyperopic error, we have to have limited options, but myopic error is very comfortable. LASIK is my preferred method of choice.
Okay. So I see Dr. Amrita is there. Huh? Dr. Amrita, would you like to comment? Some question has come in. How to measure axial length if we don't have optical? I did address it. What is your suggestion for? You need to unmute your mic. Yeah, Dr. Amrita.
Hi, Dr. Mehta. Nice presentation.
Would you any comments on what is the how to measure axial length if we don't have an optical biometer? Any suggestions on that? How to get an accurate axial length measurement?
Sorry, my audio is not so clear. I mean, not so.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Only partly, only very broken audio. I'm sorry.
Okay, okay. So I'll just move the question to Dr. Vinay because there's another question for him. Does the refractive surprise depend on the type and brand of IOL? Do you feel there's any, concern with that?
I would feel it would only depend if you're calculated some other brand and you're putting some other brands. If you're replacing the lenses with a different A constant, or otherwise you're putting it inside the sulcus vis-a-vis putting it in the bag, then only it would differ. But otherwise, they should not make any difference, I feel.
Okay. All right. So I think we'll go on to the next talk then.
I think there was one question I would like to stop there about my talk. There's a question about how much irrigation to do while anterior vitrectomy. And please elaborate on the technique of trocar insertion. So I think if I may ask Mayank this question, because Mayank is also a retina surgeon. So Mayank, would you like to answer this?
Yeah, could you repeat the question again, sir?
One question is how much irrigation to use while doing anterior vitrectomy. And second is to elaborate the technique on trocar insertion. So, what I told them about not twisting. So if you would like to elaborate that to them, how to do that.
So, so by inserting the trocar, twisting it, like Dr. Vinay correctly pointed out, does break the scleral fibers, and therefore that's not at all recommended. The trocar design is such that putting it at an angle of roughly about 30 degrees or so, or lesser, allows us to get a beveled entry, which makes it self-sealing. And apart from that, with regards to the irrigation, I would generally try to maintain it just as much. It's enough to maintain the anterior chamber. Not too much, not like so that chamber doesn't collapse. And at the same time, it's not too high on the fluidics.
So I think I totally agree. That one thing, therefore, I say that always use a fresh trocar and a sharp trocar when you're handling these cases. And if it is a fresh trocar and the wound and the IOP of the eye is reasonably okay, you will be able to enter easily. If the eye is hypotenuse, you will have problem, or if the trocar is blunt, you will have problem. So whenever you have a PC event, if you're handling these cases, use a fresh and clean trocar. That is very important. I think there's one very interesting question, ma'am, from Nilesh. I think he says, ma'am, do you have any way to check and prevent IOL surprise intraoperatively in high-risk cases while on table, since majority are being done under topical? So what he's doing is that he empirically asks a patient whether he's wearing, what color is he viewing. If it is more reddish, then we undercorrect the IOL in the same setting. So I don't know exactly, I mean, any idea on that? He's put in a smiley after this question also.
Yeah, it's not very scientific. So no, I don't think. I mean, if you're really worried, like if it's a child and you were not able to do a proper biometry, Then for a child, I would say do an on-table refraction, but I'm not too sure about looking at color change. So only for a child or someone where you are not sure of the biometry, that you could do an on-table refraction. I think Dr. Sangal, are you saying something? Then unmute your mic.
Dr. Gunjan Prakash wanted to know about the IOL power calculation in operated RK patient in detail. I think you mentioned about the website, so if you could just elaborate on that.
Yeah, I think that's outside the scope of this webinar. You would need to, use the various calculate. There are lots of software for calculating the formulae, depending on what the problem is, post RK or post or silicon filled eyes. So you have to change settings on your instrument also. So I think we'll discuss that at some later time.
And one last question I'll take before we move on to the next topic is that biometry should be done by ophthalmic. Sure, sir.
Who's that?
Regarding post-LASIK or post-RK cases, calculation of IOL, see, axial length is not the issue. The issue is the keratometry. We never get a proper keratometry because it is very flat in the center and no keratometer will give us the correct reading. So we should do topography and mark the flattest reading on the screen. That may not be in the exact center, maybe slightly eccentric, but we have to look for the flattest reading. Take that flattest reading as your keratometry, which will never get with the keratometer. And then you calculate the IOL power with that keratometry. Then the chance of error is less. But still, you can still add +2 diopters to whatever you get with this reading also to be on the safe side. It's better to have a myope patient than to have a hyperope patient.
Okay.
I think that is great. I think you can't get a better person with more experience on refractive surgeries than Dr. Paul. And I think this is a very valuable tool that you're giving us, sir. So one question was that who should be doing the biometry, whether an ophthalmic technician or an ophthalmologist? So my answer would be whoever is more confident in doing that. So in my place, probably my optometrist is doing a better job than what I do. So whoever is better at doing it should be doing that. But someone senior should be doing it, especially in these tricky cases.
Yeah, I agree with you that the optometrists are doing this every day. So they are definitely better at it, but we can just oversee and make sure, that two people or pick up, call if there's a need to take a call.
Sure. I think now should we move on to the next presentation? If there's some questions left, we will take it up later. So next, I think Bharat will be joining us, and he will be presenting about the complication, which is very dreaded to all of us, post-operative endophthalmitis, how to identify that and how to initially do the management of that. So Bharat, if you could start sharing the screen.
Yes, sir. So, good evening, everybody. As you know, endophthalmitis is, I think, probably the only contender which scares us more than PCR, because we have a patient, we have done a thorough examination, a very proper counseling, taken a written consent, especially if it is a polar case or a high-risk case or a diabetic patient, and we have an uneventful surgery. The patient gets a good vision, we breathe a sigh of relief. It's a happy ending for everybody. But then we get a phone call from the patient after a few days with the complaints of diminution of vision or pain, lid edema, chemosis, hypopyon, corneal clouding, fibrinous membrane, and the doctor gets a high BP because of the anxiety. And these are some of the worst pictures we can see in the eye when the patient comes for follow-up with the fibrinous membrane or a big hypopyon, spikes in the vitreous on your B scan, and a hazy cornea. So what to do in this case? So first thing, we need to know the differential diagnosis which can cause these things. You have to rule out toxic anterior segment syndrome or TAS, any form of chronic keratitis or conjunctivitis in post-trabeculectomy eyes, blebitis, any causes of hypopyon, uveitis like herpes or tubercular, any retained lens matter which has been inadvertently left behind, or a post-op IOP spike which can cause corneal clouding and maybe a little bit of reaction. We should keep a high index of suspicion, call the patient for an examination, look for any other causes of vision loss or undue inflammation. Go back to your surgical, we record all of our surgeries, so you go back to your surgical recording, see if there has been too much manipulation. So a very small pupil, a lot of handling of the iris, prolonged surgery or PCR can have inflammation that is expected in the initial post-op period. Then we have to look for any predisposing factors for endophthalmitis, a chronic blepharitis, or a diabetic patient, or an immunocompromised patient. A diagnosis of endophthalmitis has to be made on time, but a suspicion should always be there if a post-op patient complains of these symptoms. And we have to counsel the patient and their attendants that there is a risk of endophthalmitis in this case, and you have to be very truthful with them. Investigate it thoroughly and do a good eye examination. Look for local causes of infection, blepharitis, a stike. Meibomian dysfunction is quite prevalent these days. Look for chronic conjunctivitis, maybe follicles which you have missed earlier. Always check the fundus glow if it is there or not. That will help you distinguish between endophthalmitis and TAS. IOP should be checked. If you're not doing NCT or applanation these days, then do a digital IOP at least. See if it is a corneal clouding or an inflammation which is just because of a post-op IOP spike, and investigate the history of onset of symptoms, whether the patient gained any useful vision or was pain-free in the immediate post-op period, or has it been throughout the post-op period, or it has developed recently. Do a B scan, an aqueous tap and a vitreous tap, and these taps should be sent for gram stain, GIMSA. A KOH can be done instantly, bacterial and fungal culture, and in some cases a PCR might be needed. It is advisable to take a conjunctival swab to rule out the commensal flora, and we also use the biological indicators in the OT, in the ETO machine, and the autoclave should also be investigated. So what to do besides the treatment? You have to check the OT register for the date of surgery and make sure all the patients operated in that time period are doing fine. We also keep a list of all the consumables which have been used. We go back to that list, tally it with our patient record, because our OT people keep very meticulous records of every consumable used in every patient. So we cross-check with consumables of the same batch used in other patients done on the same day. And we can call the other patients for follow-up just to say hi, see they're doing well. If we find anything which is a source of infection, we have to see if we have recently changed anything in our OT protocols, maybe a new equipment or a new instrument or a new set which we are using. Document this case properly and check on previous documents. These patients will require a lot of chair time because you have to be truthful with them. They might need further surgeries, they might need 1 or 2 or 3 intravitreal injections, and the treatment will be long. And remember, these patients who are not satisfied, they might go for second or third opinions also. So it is our duty to keep them with us and handle their concern and give them usable vision so that they come back to us. So something which NABH recommends, which we are doing, is an RCA CAPA, that is root cause analysis and corrective and preventive action, done for every single case of endophthalmitis. It is a sentinel, it is a adverse event which should be documented, and then your hospital infection committee should suggest changes to be made in the protocol to prevent future infections. Remember, for endophthalmitis, prevention is always better than a cure. So you can use preoperative topical antibiotic prophylaxis. Perioperative oral antibiotics don't have a very proven role, but a cleaning and instillation of povidone iodine drops in the conjunctival cul-de-sac is the most efficient method we have for disinfection. Many people use intracameral moxifloxacin. It has shown promise, although it is not approved. But you can use unims or pre-filled syringes so that you have a very small dose of moxifloxacin. So contamination in the solution by the vial is not there. So a pre-filled syringe would be a better idea if you're planning on using an intracameral moxifloxacin. The OT AHU system should be functioning well. You change the HEPA filters on a regular basis. Have a talk with your OT maintenance guy now that 1.5 months has gone by when the OT has not been used. So get your technician to come in, check the AC. It should be functioning well before you start doing cataract cases, because to prevent COVID, you shouldn't end up with endophthalmitis due to another cause. And staff training and education in infection control practices should be done periodically. You should have a schedule for all the protocols. We have to rule out toxic anterior segment syndrome or TAS. Usually TAS presents very early, usually within the first 12 to 24 hours. The diminution of vision is usually less, pain will be milder, but there are cases of endophthalmitis also which don't have any pain. So those don't just use pain as a criteria. Corneal edema is more pronounced, but the vitreous is clear. So you can, if the vitreous is visible, then obviously you would suspect TAS more. If it is not visible, do a B scan. If it is clear, then chances are it is TAS. However, if there is a gray area or there is a doubt, treat it as endophthalmitis. It is better to give an extra intravitreal antibiotic rather than having a patient lose useful because you were controlling it as TAS. So next would be to assess the visual acuity. If it is hand movements, then you can do a vitreous tap, a culture, and give intravitreal antibiotics, see for improvement, repeat the vitreous culture. And if the vision is only light perception, or if it doesn't improve with intravitreal antibiotics, then go ahead with the vitrectomy and repeat culture. Systemic causes like diabetes should be controlled because that will help in your wound healing. The tendency, chances and of infection will increase if the diabetes is not in control. Also, diabetic patients, they were found to be more prone, they would respond better with vitrectomy. So vitrectomy is a very useful thing. It helps you reduce the load of the microorganism, whatever be the cause of the endophthalmitis. In later cases, it can also clear the vitreous opacities which are left behind. Even after the infection has cleared, there will be some opacities left behind that will be removed with the vitrectomy. But in the vitrectomy, PVD induction has to be proper and thoroughly done. It will help to reduce the cytokines and other toxins left on the retina. So proper PVD induction is essential. It might be difficult in some cases if it is a very fulminant infection. You can combine the vitrectomy with the injection of intravitreal antibiotics, and vitrectomy is more useful in diabetics and immunocompromised individuals who may not respond as well to intravitreal antibiotics. And if you have any other complications like dropped lens matter or cortical matter which has caused more reaction, because many of end of cases do have a PCR component, vitreous in the wound might be a factor which has caused the end of in the first place. So those other complications can also be managed in the same sitting. So you should have a lower threshold for vitrectomy in these cases. There are other modalities which have to be considered. Systemic antibiotics can be used in certain cases. Steroids for very chronic cases, maybe initially after giving the antibiotics, both systemic and intravitreal steroids are given. In chronic low-grade endophthalmitis because of P. acnes and other organisms, we might even require an IOL explantation at a later date or an intraocular or in the bag antibiotic injection. So these can be considered. Do not lose hope. Most of the cases with post-operative endophthalmitis can get good and satisfactory results if we recognize the clinical features at the earliest, institute prompt and aggressive therapy, have a long follow-up, and develop trust with the patient, counsel them properly. And we have the advantage that we have Dr. Vinay in our institute, so we have a big retina person to manage endophthalmitis cases if we have any. So always have a retina person along involved in the management right from the beginning. Even if you are suspecting TAS, keep the retina person in loop that this patient will require management later. Every anterior segment person should know how to give to prepare and to give intravitreal antibiotics, and that sir will be covering in his talk. So preparation is the key. Emergencies do happen. Be ready. Have to prepare for everything and be prepared for anything. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bharat. That was a very good exhaustive coverage of endophthalmitis. Somebody's unmuted. Yeah. So I'm just quickly going to, I really want to highlight what he said is that early recognition is the key. As a surgeon, it is a very, you feel very despondent to even acknowledge that it's an endophthalmitis. So it's just best to do an early recognition, because the earlier you get in, the better the result. So it's not like a crime. If it's there, it's there. We just have to tackle it. So I think early recognition is really, really important. Now I'd like to ask Dr. Bhatia. So because we are in these COVID times not doing, syringing or, DCR. So I'd just like to ask you, sir, if there is, a regurgitation positive or, chronic dacryocystitis with a mature cataract or with a cataract that really needs to be operated, what is the procedure? What would you recommend? What should we do so that we can avoid this chance of getting endophthalmitis? So please unmute your mic. Yes. Yes, sir.
Am I audible? Am I audible?
Yes, sir. Yes.
See, as we have decided in our Oculoplasty Association meeting, the syringing is not to be done. And I think the best thing will be just to press over the lacrimal sac area and find out if there is any discharge or no discharge. And if we find that there is no discharge, then we are on a reasonable with the use of moxifloxacin or any good antibiotic, you can take up the case for surgery. And ask in the history also whether there was any discharge or previous history of any dacryocystitis or recurrence, anything which was there. That will give us a correct guideline for whether we can take up for surgery or not. Because even the cautery of that area, cauterization of the puncta, etc., that is also not recommended in this COVID area.
Right.
At the moment.
So, yeah, I think if
I will
we
go more
really...
by the clinical presentation and take up the case for surgery after proper antibiotic instillations.
Right. And if we really have to do a surgery, then I think a dacrocystectomy, if we have to do it, if it is there, then we would prefer a dacrocystectomy over a DCR if we have to do the surgery.
Yes.
Okay, thank you, sir. So another question I want to ask Dr. Arun. Dr. Arun, do you use any intracameral as a prevention, any intracameral? I'm using moxifloxacin regularly, and I find that it's a really good one. I'm not using the pre-filled ones as yet. So do you use any intracameral antibiotics? Please unmute yourself, Dr. Sangal. Host, can you unmute Dr. Sangal, please?
Yeah. Is it audible now?
Yes.
Yeah. No, I'm not using any intracameral antibiotic at all. And you see, the cases are so rare, it's very difficult to say at times. You see, somehow that whether really you've been preventing it or not preventing it is very difficult at times.
Absolutely. I started using it about 5 years ago when I had a case of endophthalmitis. After that, you just don't want it to happen again. So that's really, I think, how we go. And conjunctival swab, I don't know, does anybody still do that? Dr. Gupta, do you use the conjunctival, or let's ask Dr. Surbi since she's, do you use a conjunctival swab?
I'm not using intracameral or subconjunctival injections.
No, conjunctival swab before operating, are we all,
No.
is anyone still? No. So Dr. Surbi, can you unmute yourself? Dr. Surbi, yeah. Dr. Surbi?
Yeah, ma'am. Yeah, please. Yeah.
So I just want to ask from you, from the cornea point of view, if we do have a case of endophthalmitis, which antibiotic would you prefer from the view of penetration through the cornea and decreasing the corneal toxicity. Because if we have endophthalmitis, we go into 2-hourly and we go into really frequent instillation. So which antibiotics do you prefer?
So, ma'am, as such, if we have a case of endophthalmitis, it's always better to start with fortifieds, cephas and toba, because at that point we're not really seeing for the toxicity of the cornea, because we want the penetration to happen. And as such, studies have shown the penetration and the efficacy of fortifieds as such for corneal infections is equally okay compared to all the other, the topical drops. But when we have a case of endophthalmitis, the penetration wise, the fortifieds are always better. So if we have to think of a long term, which we don't for endophthalmitis, for that 10 days and all, I think fortifieds is better. Cepha, toba, amica would be the choice for me.
Okay.
We don't have to think of the
Dr. Maya?
Just that 10 days.
Right. Or the penetration also we don't have to think, because we just want it fortified, right? Okay.
No,
Dr. Maya?
Penetration is better. Penetration is better,
when
ma'am.
it's fortified,
The fortifieds. Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so Dr. Maya, you have a question, I think. It's come up in the, did you want to ask something?
No.
Okay.
Dr. Anita, just one
This is a
thing.
question.
Dr. Anita, you're asking, Dr.
Yes,
Anita,
yes.
how many days prior to the surgery you want the antibiotic, local drops to be started? Do you give any oral antibiotic prior to surgery, and how many days it is necessary? Any guidelines
So I think
on
everybody
that?
has their own. Yeah. I don't think there is now no role of oral antibiotics. I would like to check with Dr. Vinay if there is a role once endophthalmitis has been diagnosed, but preoperatively there is no role. I use moxifloxacillin, so broad spectrum antibiotic, and I start 2 days before. Though actually if we are using betadine preoperatively, even 1 day or even the morning, I don't think there is a lot of, unless it's a really dirty eye or there's mebomitis or there's a lot of discharge, then those cases maybe definitely 2 days before. Otherwise, 1 day before is also good. And if there is mebomitis, we actually ask them to even treat, do some lid massage and improve the lid hygiene before you come in for the cataract surgery. Dr. Vinay, do you have any other view? Antibiotic?
So we don't use any systemic antibiotic either before or after the surgery. 1 day before, I start them on topical antibiotic along with ketorolac combination, so that helps in pupillary dilatation also for us. And the most important factor is a good betadine in the conjunctival sac. That is one thing that has been proven. So that we must do before the surgery, in the recovery, before they're coming in pre-op, and also before the surgery on the table also. So that is the most important thing. I think, should I take up my talk also, then we can discuss the endophthalmitis together. So the procedure of intravitreal was a small thing I wanted to talk about.
Right. I just add that betadine will also kill the COVID. So, go betadine. That's the way to go. It's going to kill the COVID as well. Yeah. Okay. So let's hear about intravitreal from Dr. Vinay.
So the reason I took up this talk is because I'm very passionate about this thing, and as a few of my colleagues were also there in the symposium I see in the audience, they would remember my professor, Professor H.K. Tiwari, would always say that people refer you the endophthalmitis very late, and they don't give intravitreal before referring to you. Therefore, in my previous talk also I said every anterior segment surgeon must know 2 steps: how to do anterior vitrectomy and how to give intravitreal injection. So whenever you have endop, as Bharat has very rightly pointed out, start the treatment as soon as possible, or on the side of infection, even if it is stars. If you are doubtful, think about it as endop, and give intravitreal antibiotic as soon as possible. May even start oral or intravitreal steroids. I personally prefer oral steroids over intravitreal, and PPV is in more fulminant cases. So as Bharat said, keep the posterior segment person in the loop the moment you suspect something. So we'll be covering 4 aspects of intravitreal injection: why, when, what, and how. So why do we need an intravitreal injection? It's because there's a blood-retinal barrier. So the oral antibiotics may not enter the eye very well. And also the maximum availability is there in the local area without any systemic side effects. And there's a depot action, so it works for about 48 to 72 hours. And when do we give it? As soon as possible. And whenever you suspect, you give antibiotic or antifungal. Most of the times we'll be talking about antibiotics because antifungal you will only be giving in chronic cases. By that time, you would have referred to a posterior segment surgeon. So we are restricting our talk to the anterior segment people. So whenever there's a confirmed or suspected endophthalmitis, do not delay, give injection and then refer. Many times by the time the patient comes to us, this thing has already started to respond because they've given the injection early. So don't refer a patient to a posterior segment person for intravitreal antibiotics. Again, quoting Dr. Tiwari, because that was a time when a lot of intravitreal triamcinolone was used to be given. Now it is being given as Avastin. So he would say that there are people who are very happy to give steroids intravitreal, or nowadays Avastin or Lucentis intravitreal, but they're scared of giving intravitreal antibiotics. Rather, intravitreal antibiotic must be given by the cataract surgeon. There are a few issues with that. There are a few fears that are there in the mind that I would like to clear in this presentation, hopefully. So what to give is vancomycin and ceftazidime, the standard regime that we are following. So vancomycin, we give about 1 milligram in 0.1 ml, and ceftazidime 2.25 milligram in 0.09 ml. Don't have to remember this. I think there are AIOS has also circulated that you should have this chart in your OT to know how to dilute and how to prepare this injection. You cannot remember it because this is doesn't happen on a regular basis. Always refer to the printed guidelines to make it, because an error of dilution can make the dosage 10 times here or there. Sometimes you may use amikacin, but nowadays we don't use it for much because of macular toxicity. Other thing is, don't mix up vancomycin with ceftazidime because they tend to coagulate. So give them with two different syringes. That is important. You may give amphotericin B or steroids also. So briefly, I have to tell you about vancomycin. I normally do it that you get a 500 milligram vial. I dissolve that in 5 ml of Ringer lactate to make it 100 milligram per ml. And then I take 0.1 ml of that and make it into 1 ml. So dilute it 10 times more to make it 10 milligram per ml. And 0.1 ml of that would have 1 milligram. Similarly, for ceftazidime, depending upon whether it is 500 milligram or 1 gram, you dissolve in 2 or 4 ml respectively to make it 250 milligram per ml. Then again, dilute it 10 times to 25 milligram per ml. And then inject 0.09 ml. That means slightly less than 0.1 ml of this thing. And dexamethasone, again, you may give to 360 microgram, but I normally prefer to give steroids orally because it has got a good penetration, and you can always stop oral steroids whenever you feel that things are worsening or something. So I prefer to give steroids not as intravitreal, but as oral supplementation. This is a small video about how to prepare intravitreal, how to dilute. So you need Ringer lactate or water for injection, tuberculin syringes, and ceftazidime or vancomycin, the way I told you, diluted. You withdraw about more than 0.1 ml of this, discard the rest and keep only 0.1 ml inside. And after that, so this is the active drug, which you want to dilute 10 times. So you basically withdraw Ringer lactate or water for injection to make it to 1 ml. After doing that, make sure there's a very small bubble that is there inside. You make sure the bubble goes all the way up and all the way down twice. So it is going to mix up the fluid because it's a very, very thin bore thing, so it may not mix up otherwise. Once it has got mixed up, then you discard the rest of the 0.9 ml of this and keep 0.1 ml to be used for injection. The same thing you can do with the ceftazidime also. So this is how you dilute the thing in the OT. So it's important is to mix them well, because otherwise you may not be giving it properly. Now, how to give it? We normally give small dose of intravitreal, 0.05 ml we give for normally anti-VEGFs, but for here we are giving about 0.2 ml, 0.1 ml of each drug. In the OT, under topical anesthesia, 3 to 3.5 millimeter from limbus. The most important part in this slide is the vitreous tap or a biopsy. Before you give the injection, we would like to take a sample. The sample is important for two reasons. One is to get a sample to send it for the culture and for the smears, as Bharat had explained. So for that, we need a sample. And second, to decrease the pressure of the eye, because remember, you're injecting 0.2 ml inside the eye, the pressure is going to become very high. So you have to compensate for that also. But the biggest problem that you have in this vitreous tap is sometimes you may have a dry tap. You go inside, you try to pull, but then you may not get any vitreous sample. So it used to, when I was a JR and I was sent in RP center, I would be sent to give an intravitreal. People would feel bad if they have not been able to get a sample, and then you will end up pulling it very hard to try to get a sample. This is what we must not do, because if you pull hard, then you are going to cause traction, and it's already a friable retina. You will cause tears and detachment. You gently go in with a 2 ml syringe attached to a 23 gauge needle. Go inside, gently pull. If you are inside a liquid pocket, you will get the sample easily. If you are in the formed vitreous, you would not get it. Heavens won't fall if you don't get a sample. Leave it there, because the management immediately doesn't depend upon the sample anyways. You are giving the antibiotic right there and then. In that case, just to decrease the pressure, you may do a paracentesis in the end to decrease the pressure later on, but do not pull hard to get a sample. If we don't make this mistake, intravitreal antibiotic injection is a very, very safe procedure. You give the injection, and then after that, if the pressures are high, you can do an aqueous tap. So it is perfectly okay. It is not a prestige issue if you don't get a sample, because it is a totally blind procedure. You don't know where your needle is going to be going in. So heavens won't fall if you don't get a sample, but please do not pull hard on the vitreous. This is the only carry-home message that I wanted to give in this talk, besides the fact that you should know how to give intravitreal and not be scared of giving intravitreal. So to conclude, intravitreal antibiotic is an emergency procedure which must be performed by the surgeon at the time of diagnosis. Now, coming to a few more slides that I would like to give. I mean, this is something coming from my own personal experience about how to handle a complication when it happens in your place. So as it has been pointed out, keep the VR surgeon in the loop right from the beginning. Do the initial management. Prepare the patient mentally for the possibility of a further surgery or further things. Because, it's always better to tell them that this is the situation, we are trying, but yes, you may require a vitrectomy or further procedures, so that he has some time to build up his mind. He also has time to go to take other opinions also, because it is perfectly okay to have a complication, but it is criminal to hide the complication and hide the consequences from the patient. Don't be scared of complication, but please don't hide it from the patient. And in case there's no response or fulminant course, you do refer to the VR surgeon. The vitrectomy is simple. You do the purpose is to remove the infective load, also improves the antibiotic penetration, removes the toxins, clears the media, and also if there's any coexisting problem that is taken care of. Important for vitrectomy is use a good machine with a good cutter. Often when I was training, that's again like about 20 years back, we would be getting the worst possible machine for end of vitrectomy, and therefore the results used to be bad. And somewhere we switched over to the regular good machines, and suddenly our surgical times became faster and the results became better. So always use a good machine. These are very, very sick eyes. They need a good quality machine and good quality cutter. Do more than core vitrectomy, though the study that was done did talk about core vitrectomy, but nowadays with better machines, we do near total vitrectomy. And some of the cases may need silicone oil also if you feel that if you're going all the way to the base dissection. And with better results are being achieved by doing more aggressive management. So I'll be showing one small video of endophthalmitis that was managed by me. This is a bit old video, so the quality of video is not that good. So you make a port. First of all, you clear the anterior vitreous. You can see there's a very poor visibility. The cornea is also a bit hazy. And then you start doing the vitrectomy. Till you see the retina, you are very, very unsure. To go very gently, go slow. The moment you start seeing the retina, you kind of heave a sigh of relief. You get a plane also where to work. Now here I'm kind of removing a bit of posterior capsules to kind of improve my visibility. Now you can see the disc is visible. So you know that, okay, you are in the right plane. A bit of glow has started to be seen. And now towards the end of surgery, we see that there are lots of exudates lying on the retina. And you can just use the suction of the cutter to remove those exudates also. You can see the exudates on the retina are being picked up by the suction. So you can almost near total vitrectomy you are able to do in these cases. Here you can see the retina, you can see the all the exudates on the retina are being picked up by the cutter. At the end, you can always give an intravitreal antibiotic at the end of the surgery. And I always use 25 gauge vitrectomy for these cases. And majority of the times now, if the patients are handled properly, you get good results. So again, going back to how to counsel the patient, be truthful, don't be defensive. I mean, that is one important thing I would say. It is perfectly okay to have a complication. Don't be defensive. Rather than taking blame for it, take the credit for managing a complication, whether it is a PC rent or an end-off. You know, complications happen with everyone. But you must take the credit that, okay, you had a problem which I have handled very well. Let us see what is going to happen. And keep the patient and attendants informed about the potential problems. This is good for their morale as well, and also for you medical legally. Majority of patients who end up having a PC rent in my OT end up thanking me profusely for managing it well rather than blaming it. So you have to take credit for handling these problems rather than take blame for creating the problem, because problem would happen anyway. You should know how to handle it. So mentally prepare them for future surgeries. Don't promise that everything will be all right. Do tell them that, yes, this is a problem. We are together with you, but don't promise everything will be all right, because later on the patients are going to come back to you. Promise them, tell them that there are potential problems, and later when the things become better, they are always happy. For example, yesterday when I took up that case of dropped IUL, I told them that, you know, depending upon the situation of the capsule, I may or may not be able to implant the lens. So I prepared them for the worst, and later when I put up the lens, the patient's attendants were so happy they were almost going to be touching my feet, but thanks to social distancing, I prevented them from doing that. So always give them the worst possible scenario, and then they are going to be happy with whatever they get. And be clear about that. And of course, don't ever criticize other people's complications, because all of us have it. I would rather tell the people that good that you have been sent at the right time, we are going to be handling it. Again, to err is human, but to manage it well is divine. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Vinay, for really, that was a very, very good and concise and very well explained on what needs to be done. Yes, Dr. Gupta, we'll just come to you. I just want to, there's one question from Dr. Kedar, which is, who should give the intravitreal? Should it be the primary surgeon or a VR surgeon? Dr. Vinay has already told us that it has to be the anterior segment surgeon. However, if within your practice you do have a retina surgeon, I would really advise everyone to have a good friend who's a retinal surgeon. You could maybe, have something, work it out between the two of you. But whoever is giving it must be very sure, and yes, you must keep it written because we can't remember it. And just face it. Give it your best, and you'll always be able to manage. One quick question is from Dr. Abhishek. He wants to know whether we can mix voriconazole with ceftazidime or Vanco. Which one is preferable? So, Dr. Vinay, can you just quickly answer that? Mixing antifungal with which antibiotic?
I, as a principle, don't mix any antibiotic, number one. And antifungal, normally by the time it comes to antifungal, we already are in the vitrectomy stage. So if we were doing a vitrectomy for any fungal infection, I would do a vitrectomy. I won't give only a plain antifungal intravitreal. So if I'm suspecting antifungal, I'll be doing a vitrectomy, and then after that, I'll be giving an antifungal only. At that stage, there's no point of giving ceftazidime because chances are these are delayed onset thing. It is not a gram negative. So I would only stick with antifungal only.
Okay. So yes, Dr. Satish, you have a question?
No, I just wanted to make a comment that not all the times you get a very clear cornea for doing a vitrectomy. If there are infiltrates in the cornea, you can use a temporary keratoprosthesis. Later on, use a preserved graft, a glycerine preserved graft. Maybe you require the services of a cornea surgeon at that time.
Okay, right. That's a good input. Dr. Vinay, there's another question from Dr. Jayashree. That is there any special precautions for intravitreal in this COVID era? And I think she meant it for just intravitreal, not really only for an antibiotic. So any special precaution for intravitreal in COVID era?
I think I'll take an intravitreal also as a minor surgical procedure. So the same precautions that we are having for other surgeries will go. But frankly speaking, as we'll be discussing, we are not taking any special precaution for OT in COVID, except for the fact that the patient is wearing a mask, and we are trying to stagger our patients. So after every patient, there's a kind of the whole trolley gets repeated again, and clean a mop of the OT is being done. Besides that, we don't recommend any change in the OT practices. So the number of cases that you can do again depends upon your OT setup. So, every 20 minutes you can keep giving the injections, as many, provided you can maintain not too much of crowd in your OT. But we don't have those many patients right now. So I think right now we have very limited patients, so we are able to manage that.
Okay. So I think we can go on onto the next.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah,
if
sure.
we have time?
Yeah.
Sir, sir, in case of a fungal endophthalmitis post-cataract surgery, would you take care of the lens or would you want to just keep it? What would your call be?
Fungal endophthalmitis, I don't need to take out the lens, but of course, these are generally poor prognosis cases. But I would like to do a very nice, clear, nice vitrectomy, even for case of say delayed endophthalmitis, propionibacterium, where we always talk about removing the whole lens and back complex. Even there, I try to preserve the lens. I'll do a capsulectomy and try to clear up as much of cortical matter or the other things as possible. But for fungal, we don't need to remove the lens at all. But those are poor prognosis cases, so we will.
But fungal, they have advocated because it acts as a scaffold, the lens. Do you have a other take for it? Do you feel that it's not really required?
It goes on case to case. If the visibility is really poor, then I may like to remove the IOL. But many times removing the IOL means opening up the wound and the whole structure of the eye kind of becomes a bit more dicey. So we do on a case to case basis, but it is not a dictum that I would always remove a lens in case of fungal endop. Mayank, would you like to comment on this?
Yeah, absolutely agree with Dr. Vinay. And in addition, like Dr. Vinay said, a case-to-case basis, and just sharing an experience since you mentioned the IOL removal. So one of the very fulminant cases that I'd seen required repeated vitrectomy, and the eye would end up going in hypotony. So that was one of the post-vitrectomy oil injection, still going into hypotony, perhaps pull on the ciliary body because of the membranes. And that was one which required an IOL removal, but generally, most of them have not needed that. And to add on to the question of mixing the antibiotics, so in case anyone really wants to give the antifungal like vancomycin, ceftazidime, and voriconazole, so giving them as separate injections would be perhaps the best. If anyone would really, taking that first question that had come in.
Okay, so I think prevention is better than cure. Let's all prevent endophthalmitis and not have to, go into these difficult situations. And I think, with phaco and small incisions and a lot of, using antibiotics, I think we're all a lot better. And during COVID, we're anyway going to not be sharing instruments, and we're going to have to be changing. So, I think that kind of housekeeping is going to decrease the incidence of our infections. So we will now go on to the next talk. Dr. Prachi is going to now talk to us about this glaucoma following surgery. Dr. Prachi.
Good evening all. I am here to talk to you about another surprise of phacoemulsification, that is post-operative glaucomas and handling the pressure. So as you all are aware that the cataract surgery can help in lowering the IOP, but there can be fluctuations in IOP after cataract surgery. So we should appropriately manage IOP fluctuations so to provide best outcome to the patients. So when you do a phaco in a glaucomatous eye, or you had a complication, or you do surgery in a child, you expect post-phaco IOP spikes. But when you had uneventful phaco and you had a IOP spike, that is a real surprise. So incidence being the 18 to 45% of experienced IOP greater than 28, and up to 9.8% required IOP greater than 30 mm of Hg for the first 24 hours. Some patients have even IOP spikes up to 68 mm of Hg, and that is a serious issue. The post-phaco IOP spike starts within the first 1 to 2 hours of the surgery, and it peaks in 8 to 12 hours and returns to normal by 24 hours. So when you see a patient in a 2 days follow-up, then patient must have gone through these IOP spikes. So this of IOP spike in the it is mostly transient diabetes patient. There may be an addition of the further damage to the optic nerve and the visual field damage, and glaucoma patients are more likely to experience IOP spike after carrying the residual OVDs, viscoelastic, PC rent, IOL in the sulcally operative glaucoma, air bubble in the AC, hyperemia, malignant glaucoma. Risk factors, this table shows the common risk factors.
Will it be better if we share the video instead of Dr. Prachi? Okay. Prachi, please stop the video sharing. I'll start sharing the screen. Just a sec.
I've started to share Prachi, so now I'll just forward it for you.
So just okay, you can look in the video that please ensure that the entire IOL is.
Yeah.
Bharat, can you please share? Okay. Okay, and the entire IOL is in the bag, and ensure that the thorough removal of the viscoelastic from the anterior chamber and the angle of the eye and behind the IOL, so to prevent the IOP spike, so to provide best outcome to the patients. So another, we have a posterior capsular rent. Already we have discussed so much, but there are chances of IOP spikes exceeding to more than 30 in first 24 hours despite prophylactic acetazolamide. So IOP elevation in an IOL placed in a sulcus can be managed by redialing of the IOL. Anterior subluxation of the IOL or the pupillary capture can be managed by repositioning of the IOL. Retained cortical matter in anterior chamber or the vitreous cavity can cause IOP elevation. Patient may present as a red painful eye, can be treated with topical corticosteroids or anti-glaucoma drug, and may this requires a surgical removal of residual lens matter. So air bubble in a AC, if a small air bubble won't cause any problem, but if a large air bubble may cause post-op IOP in rise, that can be managed by either positioning of the patient in a supine position or with the topical Midratide or the oral oral anti-glaucoma medication, or we may do anterior chamber decompression. Hyphemas, the larger hyphema may cause higher IOP. If the IOP is less than 40, we can manage it conservatively, or but we need to do surgical intervention in the case if the IOP is more than 40, or in case of any corneal staining. Next slide. So here comes the role of pre-operative IOP. If there's a higher baseline IOP is associated with the high risk of post-op IOP spikes. Most of in the 30% of the patient experience IOP spike had glaucoma, and it is more in the pseudo exfoliation or primary open angle glaucomas. Next slide, please. So pressure spikes are usually benign except in the glaucoma, as I said previously, or in the damaged optic nerve, like in the ischemic optic neuropathy, anemia, systemic hypertension. Next slide, please. So surgeons' experience matter a lot, like increased spikes and increased pressure spikes with a inexperienced surgeon because of excessive handling of the tissue. Next slide, please. So myopic patients have tendency for increased IOP after an uneventful surgery. Next slide, please. We tend to give the post-operative corticosteroids. Okay, so there are the majority of studies reported IOP spikes between 3 to 6 weeks after the topical steroids, and about 5% of the population is steroid responders. And IOP rise after dexamethasone is often higher than the prednisolone. Next slide, please. So it is best to treat steroid responders, to taper the steroids or to stop steroids, and you can use NSAIDs in place of steroids to control any residual inflammation. And in addition to this, we can give IOP lowering drugs, and we need to balance between the inflammation and IOP. Coming to the capsular distension syndrome, as you can have seen in the video, the thorough washing of the viscoelastic behind the IOL is important. Otherwise, the fluid will accumulate between the IOL and the posterior capsule, which will lead to the expansion of the posterior capsule and thus displacing the IOL anteriorly. Next slide, please. So here's the malignant glaucoma, one of the dreaded complication, or the aqueous humor is directed posteriorly into the vitreous cavity, and the vitreous move forwards with the shallowing of the AC. So we need a surgical intervention. Okay, next slide. So the proposed guidelines are: identify the patients at risk like damaged optic nerve or patient requiring glaucoma. We need to give them prophylactic treatment of anti-glaucoma drugs before and after the surgery to blunt the spikes and ensure complete removal of OVDs. Intracameral myotics can be used, and aggressive therapy for PC Rent, and we consider combined surgery for glaucoma cases with advanced damage. Next slide, please. So to conclude, IOP spike in a cataract surgery in a non-glaucomatous patient is a transient and can be controlled easily, so do not panic. And do consider steroid responders. An IOP spike in a glaucoma patient may cause visual field deterioration. Therefore, we must do a combined surgery in them. Next slide. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Prachi. It was quite comprehensive. I think I'll just stop sharing my screen. How do I do that?
I got a question for Dr. Amrita. So because we are not doing so many follow-ups post-op, we are trying to limit our post-op follow-ups. So is there any role of giving some amount of anti-glaucoma immediate post-op, or do you give any anti-glaucoma medication in the post-op routinely? Amrita, unmute yourself.
Yeah. Hi, Dr. Neem.
Yeah.
Yeah. Normally, I have not given glaucoma medication, though many people do. Traditionally, we used to give, but with the quicker surgeries now, uncomplicated cases, I really don't feel any need. And just the side effects of more and more drugs after surgery, the dryness makes the patient a little uncomfortable. So I feel there is no need to give anti-glaucoma in every patient who undergoes a glaucoma surgery, cataract surgery. So, but yeah, now in these times, in COVID times, since we're not going to be following patients very closely, we can give, but then we have to look at drugs which are the least toxic to the ocular surface. So probably something like, a dorzolamide or a brinzolamide, I would prefer to give rather than the other drugs which are more toxic. Yes.
Okay. And in your glaucoma patients, like if somebody is already on any anti-glaucoma medicine before cataract surgery, what do you do in the post-operative for those patients?
Yeah. No, they should start the anti-glaucoma medication immediately post-op after cataract surgery.
Even if they're
initially we used to stop prostaglandin analogs. Yeah, we used to stop that, but now we really don't. Yeah.
So I just wanted to highlight that there isn't any need to stop the prostaglandin analogs or switch it. And if they are there, I would just like to add, if there is somebody with a compromised disc or, a kind of a severe or advanced glaucoma, and if they have a relatively harder cataract, I would maybe increase their anti-glaucoma just to cover that spike, because if it's already a compromised disc, maybe that spike damages it more than another patient. So I would just defer there. I would add a little extra for the first couple of days just to be on the safe side. Yeah, Vinay?
Yeah, I think we have only 10 minutes left for the meeting, so I'm sorry about having to cut short the discussion. There's a small video that we would like to show, then we'll like to devote some time on COVID discussions also. So Viraj, if you can just play the video, and then in the meantime, we will take it over from there. I'll also be sharing a screen in the meantime while Viraj is preparing that if you have any queries, you can send your queries to me. I'm just giving my email ID. So just remember Visitech, vinay@visitech.org. So I think we would not be able to answer all the questions today. So just take a screenshot. I'll just put it again at the end. And so if there are any questions which are unanswered, we will be very happy to answer that. Viraj, please share the screen now.
Dear friends, greetings from the Synergies Visitech Eye Center, Delhi. This video would briefly explain the COVID or coronavirus related safety precautions that we are following. Of the various strategies, the most important aspect is controlling and screening of all the visitors to our facility. Every visitor, patient, attendant or staff undergoes these 5 steps of checking. Only patients with prior appointments are seen. They are asked about the symptoms of COVID or any history of contact. No one is allowed without a proper mask. If not okay, a disposable mask is provided and explained about proper usage of mask. Status on Arogya Setu app is confirmed and temperature testing is done. A lot of stress is given to social distancing and hand hygiene as well. Hand wash facilities have been provided at the entry level, which every visitor has to use. Temporary open area reception has been created and touching of objects is minimized at this place. Automated no-touch sanitizer dispenser has been provided at the entry level, which every visitor has to use. Initial checkup and the vision testing is done in an open area, and a special disposable cardboard pinhole has been provided to minimize touching. Use of stairs is encouraged and the lift usage is minimized only for vulnerable patients. Social distancing is maintained at the waiting area by installing the barriers and also by marking the places where the patients can sit and blocking a few seats. All the doors are kept open so that we minimize the touching of the doorknobs. The air conditioning is also preferably avoided. Before entering the doctor's chamber, the patient again sanitizes his hand. During examination, the touching of the eyes is minimized. Strict hand hygiene by the doctors and other medical professionals is maintained. And there are special slit lamp, indirect ophthalmoscope and table barriers that have been installed for the safety of patient and the doctor. A lot of emphasis is also being given to keep the environment clean, avoiding use of AC, keeping the doors open, and regular mopping and cleaning of all the surfaces. These are the steps that are being taken to minimize the crowds and minimize the duration of stay in the hospital for the patients. To decrease the chances of spread of infection by touching, we have taken the following steps to minimize touching of the surfaces. We have utilized the lockdown period to establish the protocols and have trained our staff extensively for these safety measures. We also continue to educate our patients by putting up various posters in the center.
I agree that these changes might make our interactions a bit more impersonal compared to the previous times. But let me assure you, while there might be a physical distancing between us, emotionally we are always there behind our patients and we will always be there to support our patients as and when required. I'm sure the synergy between the administration, the doctors, staff, patients and attendants, all of us together, if we work, we are going to come out stronger.
Stay safe and thank you for your attention.
Okay, so Dr. Vinay, I'd like to ask you, during these COVID times, what are the changes in the OT as regards the air conditioning and the use of HEPA filters? What is your recommendation or what have you done in your OT?
So as I told you, we have actually done nothing much in our OT change. We already have an HEPA filter there. So all we have done is that make it mandatory for the patient to wear a mask. There was a concern about HEPA filter initially. So the AIOS advisory that came first, it said that you should switch off your HEPA filter during the surgery. So I did one of my detachment surgeries with the HEPA filter with the AC off. But then later on, we found out that the 0.3 micron of HEPA filter can filter even smaller particles also. So it is perfectly safe to run the HEPA filter. Rather, it is recommended to run the HEPA filter with more of frequent changes. So no change needs to be done. For those who don't have an HEPA filter in their OT, well, ideally they should be having a HEPA filter, but the risk stays the same. So all I would recommend to them is make sure you keep 20 minutes between the cases and mop all the surfaces well. So if there is any viral load in the OT, that is taken care by the mopping. So there's not too much of recirculation of air that has to be done.
Yeah, I think what we also need to keep in mind is that we are the patients coming to us, and we are all in non-COVID hospitals. The patients coming to us at worst would be asymptomatic carriers. So the viral load is going to be less. So if we make the patient wear a mask, liberal use of betadine, I think we can protect both ourselves and the patients. Dr. Vivek, a question for you has been asked, whether if you are doing multiple cases, whether you should be using the same phaco probe and tubing, or should you be changing? That's the question to you.
I think we can use for 2 cases at least. Maybe not more, but for 2 cases, we can use the same tubing and the same handpiece. And if we have more than 2 cases, we need to change after 2 cases.
So actually, there is no proven place that there are no study which shows that the virus is in anywhere in the eye, in the tubing, anywhere. There aren't any studies. Few studies are only saying maybe in tears of those COVID positive patients. So, but the thing is, there's so much unknown that I don't know. I would, if I had to do 2 cases, which abhi tak to nahi hai, I would say let's change the tubing and let's change the handpiece. Let's just be on the safe side because so little is known about this virus. I don't know. That's anyway, we are not even doing more than 1 case.
So what we have is we've got 2 machines, each with 2 phaco handpieces in 2 sets. So we right now till 4 cases, we are okay, good to go. If we have more than 4 cases happening, then we would definitely be spacing them out so we can always re-autoclave those. So I think we would, for the timing, definitely like to change for every case. But yeah, I think sooner or later we will have to slowly evolve our own system.
Yeah, and a quick question for Amrita. Again, somebody wants to know that in the PCR cases where there is more inflammation and we expect the eye pressure to go up, is it okay to use PG analogs there because there is some amount of uveitis there? Is it okay to use PG analogs there? There's a question from Dr. Nitin.
No, if there are some, definitely where we're expecting more inflammation, we would avoid PG analogs. PG analogs only for uncomplicated cases, for prevention or continuation, but not in cases where we're expecting inflammation like in post-uveitic cataracts.
Okay, there. I think we have maybe 1 minute left. Dr. Vinay, would you like to sum up in the last 1 minute?
Yeah, I think I'm so sorry that we could not extend the timing, but it was actually great to have all of you guys there. And I think we have got about more than 450 people who joined us. I hope we were of some use to them. I feel bad that we could not do too much of a discussion. There's a bit of a lack of time. I'm again going to be sharing a small screen with you guys. I'm going to be sharing my personal email ID and my website. So if you have any queries, I would request you can always send a message to this and I would definitely try to answer that. The video that you saw is available on our website, on the same website that is given. So you can take some ideas from there. And in the end, I would definitely like to thank all the panelists who were there, who gave their precious time, especially Dr. Anita for moderating it so beautifully. And the people behind the Ajanta Pharma people who were a solid support, who provided us this platform to reach out to everyone, and who also were very meticulous to train us how to use this platform better and how to keep the cameras and the other things. So I really appreciate the professionalism of Mr. Viraj, who has been dealing with us. And of course, each and every one of the participants who joined in took their time out, found us worthwhile to attend our webinar, to spend the 2 hours, 2 precious hours with us. I hope we didn't disappoint you. You learned something. And thank you for all the people who sent us wonderful questions to keep the discussions going. The 2 hours passed very, very without realizing how fast it passed. So, and if there are any queries or something, we would definitely like to answer that. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Vinay.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much,
you.
everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I'm very proud to have such an eminent people working with me that I really feel blessed to have the seniors like Professor Batheria, Dr. Pal, Dr. Satish Gupta, Dr. Arun Sangal, then Dr. Anita Sethi, then my batchmate Amrita Kapoor, then Surabhi, Mayank, and Prachi and Bharat. And Mayank, by the way, is also, I think we didn't ask him that question about the CRISPR technology that is, he's working at the cutting edge research as well. So maybe next time we'll be talking about that part. So thanks everyone for being there.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Stay safe
Bye.
and get back to work. Get back to work and stay safe.
Thank you.
Stay safe.
Thank you. Bye.